Keir Starmer, David Lamy are in the US for a NATO summit. It's the 75th, I believe. Ahead of that, just a few days in office, he's had a one-to-one with President Biden. Pretty good opportunity for him. What do you think Katie Keir Starmer is trying to achieve on this visit? Obviously, they've come together to talk about NATO and the challenges, but what for him is he trying to do here?
Well, I think number one, and, there is real appetite to see that from this end too, is just to project the basic tenets of stability and a competent government. I think it's important to take a step back and understand a little bit of how the UK has been seen overseas in recent years. And it has not been pretty. Speaking to people for a piece in this week's magazine, again and again, people brought up, incidents like the Liz Truss versus lettuce match, the crashing of the British pound, Boris Johnson, and some of the spectacle that accompanied his premiership, and above all else, Brexit. I mean, the thing you hear from people over here is that the UK has just made itself less central to global affairs. It's made itself less relevant because people here used to see the UK as this sort of central pillar in how to navigate Europe. That was one of the prime value offerings that the UK had. And now, bluntly, as one person put it to me, they don't. The US spends much less time thinking about the UK than it once did.
We're less relevant, Katie, but are we irrelevant over there in the US?
No. I mean, there is definitely still relevance, and there is tremendous encouragement to see what looks like a grown-up government taking power. And it also, let's remember, the UK is one of the only good news issues coming into this conference. You've got the president of France hanging over him these very real questions about whether he can govern his country, which direction that country is headed. You've got here this monumental spectacle of Biden's presidency and whether he's going to be able to continue, whether he's going to be the Democratic nominee come November, whether Trump could get back into office and everything that might mean. So the victory of a center-left, normal-looking, competent-seeming government in the UK is this one little island of optimism in an otherwise very difficult, very complicated picture.
Here in the UK today, in lots of the press, there's pressure on Keir Starmer to make this commitment to 2.5% of GDP defence spending, and he's said that he wants to do that. He just won't commit to a timeline. Is that something you expect to hear at the summit for not just the UK, but other NATO allies to really up their spending? I know obviously Donald Trump really pushed hard, and he had a point on that, didn't he?
That's something that you hear both Trump and Biden, by the way, take credit for, is when they respectively came into office, look at where the defense spending commitments of NATO allies were and look at where they are now. I think that's a little bit disingenuous because the real motivator was not being pressured by Washington. It was Vladimir Putin waging war against Ukraine. But yes, I think publicly, you will see less of that, but privately, I think you're going to see some quite direct conversations and some real pressure to put a timeline to this because, as you said, he hasn't. Rishi Sunak had at least said by 2030. Starmer has said as soon as circumstances allow, and that this is an ironclad commitment. But, as my grandfather used to say, fine words, butter no parsnips. That is not going to, that's not going to hold much water. It also is potentially a real political liability. If it is Trump again in November, and, the way the polls are looking at this point, that is the probable outcome as we stand. That is a serious vulnerability. Trump will go after that. The Labour government, to have the best chance of navigating those very turbulent waters, is going to want to approach that administration by being able to show, here is how much we are committing to our own defense. Europe cumulatively to be able to say, here is how Europe is responding to this challenge. Europe is not freeloading. We're not delinquent, in the words that Trump likes to use. Here are the cold hard figures. Here's how much we're upping our spending. I think that could head off some of the criticism, but I don't think it's going to be sustainable, particularly in a Trump administration, to keep saying, look, we'd love to, we'll do it as soon as we can.
Talking about a Trump administration, a couple of covers ago, we featured the Foreign Secretary, David Lamy, very heavily. Our editor, Jason Cowley, was in DC with David Lamy as part of that piece. Now, it's interesting because David Lamy hasn't just been putting in the legwork with Democrats, who I guess there's more affinity with, obviously, and the Biden regime, but he reached across the aisle, didn't he? He was meeting Republicans as well, in preparation for a Trump victory. I mean, what kind of reputation do you think David Lamy has managed to build up in the US?
I think he's very well thought of over here. When I have talked to people about him and reporting out this piece, what you hear is positive. People find him impressive personally. I think he is a very good storyteller. He is very good at invoking his own personal history, and people like that. He leads on his connections to his education in America, being the first Black Briton to study at Harvard Law School. He's the first He's the first foreign secretary to be able to trace his heritage back to the slave trade. I mean, he is in a very powerful and a very apt personal position to cultivate these relationships. And I think he has also shown himself to be serious. The piece that he published in Foreign Affairs earlier this year, which I think we should probably also give his advisor Ben Judah significant credit to shaping, on progressive realism, that did make an impact. And it was a shadow foreign secretary, soon to be foreign secretary, putting forward a proactive, well thought through vision of how the UK should approach foreign policy. And so I think that really helped him. And it is very much in keeping with the times over here. You see Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, his vision was a foreign policy for the middle classes, which was essentially saying all foreign policy, we need to be able to connect back to how does that affect families, working people in the US. This can't just be an abstract concept. This has to be grounded in real world considerations. Ben Rhodes, the former Obama advisor, has a piece out in this month's Foreign Affairs on foreign policy for the world as it is. I think we are moving into this more sort of post-idealistic approach to foreign policy. I mean, fully nihilistic, if you look at Trump, but this sense of needing to be realistic about what can be achieved, where the world is, but still trying to bring to that somewhat of your own values, and in this case of the Labour government's definition of progressism.
And we were talking actually before doing today's podcast about this publication, Foreign Affairs. I mean, for our listeners and viewers, just to explain how influential it's become and how significant it is that David Lamy, well, both managed to place, but chose to place his ideas in that publication.
I would say this is now, no disrespect to our own wonderful publication, The New Statesman, it has become the most important forum for debating these ideas about grand strategy and foreign policy publicly. I mean, it has a very long history of that. This is where George Kennan posted his, then under the pseudonym X, essay on the sources of Soviet conduct back in the 1940s. And it is where you see, ambitious people who want to go into the next administration, whether that's Biden-led or Trump-led. This is where they air their ideas and say, here's what we should be doing in terms of foreign policy. So it's very widely read by the sort of selectorate classes over here. And it's significant that I think Lamy is positioning himself as somebody who is part of that conversation, someone who has ideas and who is coming to this with a real sense of wanting to achieve something, wanting to make a mark on something, and wanting to be a real player in that conversation. The one thing I would just add on the Trump side, because I think it is noticeable how much he has tried to build bridges over here with the Republican side. I mean, that's smart. It's pragmatic, given the way the polls are heading in this direction. One of the positives is that Trump really genuinely doesn't care, I don't think, whether he has a good relationship with the UK or not. He's less bothered about the status of the special relationship just as an entity in itself. What he cares about is, can he be seen to be getting a good deal? Will he be able to take credit for having pushed the UK to up its own commitment to its defence spending and to European defence? So there is somewhat of a blank page in terms of this new government making its case over here and showing why it's useful. So it's a sort of, I guess, post-idealism approach to foreign policy if it's Trump again after November.
How do you judge this Labour government's inheritance when it comes to foreign affairs? I mean, many believe that we're in the most volatile time that well, for a generation at least. We have war in Israel and Gaza, we have Ukraine, obviously, potential Trump presidency. How do you rate this inheritance compared to past UK governments of recent times?
I mean, there's no way to sugarcoat it. This is an extremely challenging environment. This is probably the most volatile situation in global affairs, certainly since the end of the Cold War. And when you speak to people over here, there is still some squeamishness about the use of the term Cold War itself. But I think there is that general sense of real urgency that we are now, once again, in this reordering of the global order. There are major wars underway in Europe, the Middle East, East Africa, and there is the prospect of an even greater war between the US and China. That's the sort of thing that people here are very focused on. So they are coming into a world that is really in flux, where I think there's broad agreement that the sort of post-Cold War period is now over. That sort of unipolar American moment is no more. So they are present at the creation of what comes next. But I think, I mean, one of the things that stuck out to me in working on this piece was, if this government thinks they have it tough, reflecting on some of the past experiences of Labour governments, I want to give the intellectual copyright where it's due, which is some of this came out of a conversation with David Muir, former strategy director for Gordon Brown. If you look at the Attlee government that wins the election in 26th of July, 1945. 2 days later, they're in Potsdam in Germany, where the Potsdam Conference is already underway. They go straight from being the winners of the UK general election to negotiating with Truman and Stalin. Those were truly momentous times. That is the dawning of the nuclear age. They are heading into the early years of the Cold War. They are going to experience in the course of their first 5-year term the Berlin blockade, real genuine possibility of direct conflict between the Soviet Union, the US and the UK, the first Arab-Israeli war, the victory of Mao Zedong's communists in China. So those were even more difficult times. And they faced somewhat similar, I was really struck thinking through the parallels. It was also at a moment of the international order in that case had been totally shattered. So trying to figure out what comes next, trying to convince the US to commit itself to the long-term defense of Europe, which might sound familiar, and then being upended by the Korean War that breaks out in 1950, just after they've won re-election, and which a lot of people see as really one of the key issues that pushes Attlee then from power. So, there is a long history of Labour governments being dominated by foreign affairs, and looking at what they are coming into here, I think it, really is realistic to expect that to be the same again. Right down to you cannot exclude more conflict on the Korean Peninsula. We've just seen Russia and North Korea sign their collective defense treaty. There are real parallels to the situation that Attlee's government was entering, and these are going to be monumental challenges for the new government to face.
Yeah, and you talk about in your piece how ultimately foreign affairs was that Attlee government's downfall. Really, it was the source of its downfall. How difficult do you think it's going to be for this Labour government to try and make these wins that they desperately need to gain in domestic policy, to keep various factions across our quite splintered political landscape at bay here now, when so much is going on? I mean, it's quite striking that although there was an acknowledgement that the world was a very volatile place, foreign affairs really played very little part in the election campaign itself.
You can overdo the historical parallels. I have a tendency to do that. But I think when you look at the Attlee government was embarking on a much greater project of national renewal, really dealing with a very difficult domestic outlook. But it is going to be a real constraint on, it would be one thing to come into this and decide, okay, we're going to be a formidable middle power. We're going to really, we are going to commit to this 2.5% GDP on defense. We're going to build back up the British military. We're going to be able to project power more effectively. But then you look at where the money comes from. It's going to be really hard to do that, rightly being sensible and being realistic about the fiscal circumstances and not wanting to commit to that. But then you do come to where does the money come from? And that also affects somewhat of how strong of a stand can you take? One of the things that it was striking to me how absent China was, for instance, from this electoral campaign. There just did not.
I think we heard the word once.
No, so that is going to be one of the most significant issues for this government to deal with. The next 5 years are going to be absolutely critical in terms of the US, China, EU burgeoning trade war. But also the growing risk of direct confrontation between the US, NATO ally, and most important partner, and China. So there needs to start to be a very serious public conversation now about where does the UK stand on this? What is the role that it sees itself playing? But because we're in the fiscal environment that we are in, I think that's a live issue in terms of, does the UK join on with the kind of tariffs that we're seeing the US and the EU introduce on Chinese imports? Because China is a very important export market for the UK. It's the world's second largest economy. So the UK is going to have to navigate how it stands by its principles and its values, the progressive part of the progressive realism, without then risking massive retribution and a pushback that makes the economic situation even worse. So these are really difficult challenges and balancing acts.
I mean, just to end really on the importance of the EU, because it strikes me from many of the things you've been saying that a better relationship with the EU, a closer relationship, is the key for the UK being that kind of middle power rather than a non-entity. And also with things like China, it's going to need that kind of closeness when it comes to negotiating. I mean, in the next week or so, there's another opportunity for Keir Starmer on the international stage where he welcomes the European political community to Blenheim Palace, just outside Oxford. Can you see any quick wins here? Is that going to be the right approach, this much closer relationship with the EU?
I think there will be real receptiveness to that. Difficulty, both here and in the EU, I think the US, the number one thing it would wish for from the UK is that it's solid in the EU, that it's improving relations, that it's a solid partner in European security, and that it's playing an important role in like AUKUS, for instance, in its alliance commitments around the world.
That's with Australia and the US.
Right, yes, this is a three-way pact between Australia, the UK, and the US that will commit to developing nuclear-powered submarines, which I think is a way, it's one of the examples people bring up of an area where the UK still has a lot to offer, where it is really world-beating in this area. It's somewhere where it can be a middle power, but a really important middle power that's playing a really important role in this evolving strategic competition. The problem is the EU that it will be trying to form these relationships with isn't monolithic. There are fault lines running right across that continent too, that China and other more adversarial powers really wants to exploit. So yes, that's a great first step, and people want to see that happen. But there are going to be real challenges beyond that. So I think one of the things that stood out to me speaking to people from this piece was where the UK does really well is where it's realistic about what it can do. It's not trying to bestride the world, but it's also responding with a sort of moral clarity and a clarity of purpose. So you hear a lot of praise for the UK role in Ukraine, where I think the UK was one of the leading powers that stood up and articulated what was happening and very quickly got resources and got military aid in, and where even subsequently, even though the UK isn't able to respond in the quantities it might like, by the power of its example, so by being prepared to supply longer range missiles, by sending in Challenger tanks, that has opened the gates for other countries to do the same. So I think by being sort of more realistic in terms of scope, but still clear in terms of values, moral clarity, there are still areas where the UK can really offer leadership and can succeed through the power of its example. So I guess, the summary that I come to in the piece is Britain is down but not yet out. And there is appetite for the UK to play a more important role, and for as soon as it has a stable government in power and to have its act together at home, there will be real receptivity for that overseas.
Katie, thank you so much. It's so refreshing to end on a optimistic note as well. So I will let you go and join the summit. And of course, you can keep up with Katie's international coverage online, and we'll put the link to her brilliant piece, Why Foreign Affairs Will Define the Starmer Era, in the episode notes.